It's time to get inside the Giants Huddle.
Let's go!
On Giants.com.
I like it.
And the Giants mobile app.
Boom, give me some juice.
Part of the Giants Podcast Network.
Let's roll.
Welcome to another edition of the Giants Huddle Podcast, brought to you by Citizens, the official bank of the Giants. I'm John Schmeelk, joined by Matt Citak as we react to the final episode of Giants Hard Knocks Offseason. The final episode is in the books, Matt, and we saw the Giants complete their draft. And then I guess I'll start here. Didn't get much after the draft. Like, you didn't get much of the spring workouts at all. You got like a little montage at the end. So it was pretty much draft, we're done.
Yeah, I mean, I guess they premised the whole show about, this is how Joe Schoen and the front office build the roster, and the draft is the last big part of building the roster. So I guess they thought, hey, we don't have to, show anything after that. The undrafted rookie free agents, a couple of signings that happened after, they just decided to cut it off after the draft.
Yeah, it was almost more like Hard Knocks front office than like Hard Knocks offseason. You know what I mean? Because the offseason would have included all the OTAs and minicamp and stuff like that, but it was really more just free agency and the draft. So it was almost, to me, it was kind of like Hard Knocks front office rather than Hard Knocks offseason.
Yeah, which was a little surprising because, the cameras were still here throughout the offseason program after the draft. So I thought they were going to show, at least some of the clips from OTAs. Especially some of those Malik Nabers highlights, like kind of incorporate that into the Malik Nabers getting drafted part of the show, but they decided not to show any of it. So
yeah, but we got a lot of good information and good stuff to talk about here, and it started obviously with basically the draft beginning in Vegas and finding out who these teams were picking. And we saw in the previous episode that the Giants, obviously like all NFL teams, try to figure out what other teams in the draft are going to do. And it seemed like they had everyone pretty locked in. The team they weren't sure about were the Chargers. And we saw when they went on the clock, and now this could also be edited to provide some drama in terms of creating good television. But there did seem to be some, well, you know what? We think they're picking an offensive tackle here. They didn't know if it was Joe Alt or J.C. Latham. They also thought a wide receiver was, not impossible in that point. I enjoyed the little back and forth between Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll in the draft room where Joe Schoen is, I could tell he's nervous, but he's trying to stay relaxed. And that's what he saw. What do you think here? Latham or Alt? And he goes, I think they're picking Latham. And then he asked Daboll, well, who do you think they're going to pick? And he just goes, not Malik. Which I thought was funny.
Yeah, watching that scene, it kind of made me laugh a little bit because that's kind of how I felt when I was watching the draft, waiting for our pick. In our own little draft room we have of our digital department that we say in all draft weekend, we were sitting there being like, who the Chargers are going to take, really hope it's not Malik Nabers, hope it's not Rome Odunze, hoping for one of the receivers. And so it's kind of funny watching the decision makers sit in the actual draft room sort of sitting there waiting, thinking the same thing, like, please no. And the one quote I wrote down for that scene also, what you have, just not Malik.
That's pretty good.
That was a great quote by Daves, but that kind of just goes to show how much Daves loved Malik Nabers and really wanted him here. From I believe the first or second episode, from the first time they showed Malik Nabers, I believe at the Combine, it was very clear that Brian Daboll fell in love with the kid and wanted him here basically no matter what.
Yeah, and then after the pick, Joe Schoen kind of pokes Daves. Daves, who's such an emotional guy during games, and he talks about he has a temper and all that sort of stuff, very stoic in the draft room. Doesn't say much, kind of just sits there. We'll talk about a bit of a reaction he had a little bit later on in the show. But eventually, Shane is I feel like he's trying to get Daves excited, come on, man, aren't you excited? He goes, yeah, and he goes, come on, man, according to you, he's the best wide receiver in the draft. So you heard Mike Gross say that in last week's show, that he thought Nabers was his top receiver, and now we find out, at least according to that kind of back and forth, that Daboll had him as his number one guy as well.
Yeah, it seemed to be, you mentioned Mike Groh said that Malik Nabers would be his top choice. We saw that clip last week. That seemed to be, I don't want to say the consensus because we don't know what every single person in the front office thought, but it was very clear that Malik Nabers was at or near the top of the Giants draft board. And once they made that pick, they were ecstatic. They got their number one playmaker, their number one receiver. And, we always talk about wants or needs meeting with best player available. And that's exactly what happened with the Giants, with Malik Nabers. They needed an offensive playmaker, someone that they could just get the ball in his hands and let him go. And Malik Nabers is probably the best player in the draft in that regard.
Yeah, we saw, I think Joe Shane was talking, I think it was to Ryan Cowden, basically saying, look, we have, Nabers and Adunze are ready here. Those are the two names you want to have ready here just in case you pick. Again, other people could have been in the mix there too that didn't want to put them in the episode. But they had one more chance to trade out of the pick. The Colts made a call offering 15-46, their second rounder this year, then their second rounder in 2025. Joe Shane, talking to Chris Ballard, is like, all right, I'll let you know. And then he hangs up the phone. He's like, yeah, I don't want to go that far down to 15, which is understandable because at that point, you're not getting Adunze and you're not getting Bowers, which are the two names we talked about after, I guess that was episode 4?
Yeah,
4?
last week.
So they just didn't want to move that far down. And for 2-2s, it's a nice value. I get it. But if you're trying to target one of those playmakers, you can't move down 9 spots there.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is good value. 2 second-round picks. Giants could have had 2, very solid players. They would have had back-to-back picks in the second round with 46 and 47. But, yeah, again, they needed a playmaker. And, yes, if they dropped to 15, Joe could have, worked some magic to try to move back up. But that would have then cost at least some of the additional draft capital that he had just gotten from this hypothetical trade. If they stayed at 15, they could have taken... When did Brian Thomas go to the Jaguars?
I actually brought up the draft just so I could answer these questions. Brian Thomas, I think he didn't go to the Jaguars until 21, I think, or something
and
like that.
And
he
was the first receiver gone after Adunze.
That's correct, yes.
Yeah, so they could have taken 23.
23. Mm-hmm.
So they could have taken Brian Thomas Jr., but as we've spoken about, especially in the lead up to the draft, there was a pretty significant drop off between the top 3 receivers and then the next guy. So I don't blame Joe at all for rejecting that trade. I would have done the same thing. We talked last week about how, or at least I would have been somewhat interested in that hypothetical Bears offer, but that's because it would have basically guaranteed that we still would have gotten Rome Odunze or Brock Bowers. Dropping to 15, maybe if the Giants hadn't done the trade for Brian Burns and edge rusher was still a need, then dropping to 15 and picking Lautu, who the Colts ended up taking, then I could have seen that being, a potential possibility. If they maybe did a trade, and instead of trading for Brian Burns, traded for a wide receiver, maybe then I would have considered it. But given where they were and how free agency went, they had to stay at 6 and take Malik Nabers.
And then in the tease last week, we thought we might get a trade offer from the Jets, but that never seemed to materialize.
We didn't actually hear what they offered. I was a little disappointed about that. I wanted to hear how much they were offering, or
especially
willing
since
to offer.
They had 2 ones.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine it was much. As we've seen, Joe made it very clear that if Malik or Marvin Harrison were on the board at 6, they were taking him. But whatever the offer Joe Douglas made, it couldn't have been that much if Joe didn't even bother repeating the offer or saying it to the room. I mean, I'm sure he said it to someone in the room, but it was very clear that he just shot it down immediately. So there's no way that it would have been much value there.
You're ready for a change. Payday comes early with Citizens, so go to that retreat. New You moves to the country. Now you're raising goats and launching a lifestyle brand. Are you ready for all that life brings?
Trying to think where I'm looking for the other Jets pick here. What am I missing? Didn't the Jets have 2 ones this year? Am I remembering that incorrectly?
No, I think
they did. Maybe that was 2 years ago. I was thinking about.
I think, yeah.
Yeah, but so the Jets did have a lot to offer there, but again, we never found out what the offer was. So heading into round 2, I thought it was interesting. Joe kind of updating his little board on his wall before he left for the night on Thursday, then coming back on Friday. He kind of sits everyone down again, throws out some scenarios as to what might happen. And this is tough, right? Because the Giants in round number 2, because they had traded their early round 2 pick in the trade for Brian Burns, right? So the pick they had left, I believe they were picking 15th in round number 2, right?
Yep.
So there were 14 players that had to go off the board before you're selecting. So you can't really lock in on 1 or 2 guys. That's not how this is going to work. So you have to have multiple backup plans based on how the board might fall. So it was pretty clear, and this should be no surprise. We talked about this on Big Blue Kickoff on Friday afternoon. We talked about it all throughout the draft process. We knew cornerback was a huge need. And the team wanted to try to add someone at cornerback. And they liked 2 guys in round number 2, Kool-Aid McKinstry and Kamari Lassiter.
Yeah, and Giants got close to getting one of those guys.
5 picks away.
They were within 5 picks, and then there was a little run on the corners, and both those guys got taken. And, looking at the reaction in the draft room, I mean, they showed Ryan Cowden.
We heard him too.
We heard his reaction when he found out that Lassiter was going. I believe it was 42nd overall. He was not happy. And then when he relayed the message to the room, Brian Dable kind of looked up at the ceiling, visibly frustrated. So it was clear that those two guys were pretty high up on their board at that point. But as then we saw, a few moments later, where they did a flashback to earlier in the day, Joe had a contingency plan in case those guys were both gone.
And it seemed like he didn't think they were going to. Though my sense listening to Joe talk about it, I thought Shane felt it was more likely than not those two guys would have been gone by the time the Giants picked.
Yeah, I think it was a little bit of wishful thinking. Let's hope one of these guys drops to us.
Yeah,
probably won't happen. And he had a backup plan, and a backup plan that clearly Shane Bowen, pretty much the whole defensive staff felt great about, and that was taking Tyler Nubin at 47. Shane Bowen said he was his number one safety. He was a lot of people's number one safety. I mean, they showed a sound clip of Daniel Jeremiah from NFL Network talking about Nubin, saying he was his number one safety in the class as well. Last week we spoke about how Nick Saban said that Nubin was his number one safety. So the Giants got the best safety in the draft in a lot of people's eyes. They mentioned several characteristics of Tyler Nubin. Blue, ball hawk, leadership, communication. Checks all the boxes.
And should come in and start right and contribute right away.
Yes, come in and contribute year one. I mean,
I think they actually said start year one for Nubin, if I'm not mistaken. Okay. I think they did.
So, yeah, I mean, especially after Xavier McKinney left in free agency, safety was somewhat of a big hole for the Giants roster. I mean, yes, they have some young players and guys that have actually been playing really well to start a camp between Jason Pinnock and Dane Belton, but they added a young guy here who, as we just said, checks all of their boxes, can come in and start playing right away, and they seem pretty happy with it.
Yeah, and the other thing they mentioned, the analytics department was big on Nubin. They said ball production in college does tend to translate to the NFL when you look at some of the studies that they've done. And I think they're just big fans of him as a person and a player. They did talk about the potential of potentially trading up to make sure you got one of those cornerbacks in round 2. Joe Shane said it would cost him a 4th-round pick, and given the fact they only had 6 players, and I think they realized they were still trying to fill out this roster, there were other needs. That was the pick they eventually used on Theo Johnson, that they didn't want to lose a pick where you can get a contributing player, given where this team is in terms of roster building.
Yeah, I mean, obviously at that time you don't know who's going to be there in the 4th round, so you don't know what that pick's going to turn into. But looking back at it now, knowing that the Giants got Theo Johnson in the 4th round, I'm very happy that they stood pat, took Nubin at 47 instead of trading up, because at the end of the day, I would rather have Tyler Nubin and Theo Johnson than one of Kool-Aid McKinstry or Kamari Lassiter. For me, that's there's no doubt about it, especially given Darren Waller's retirement. I mean, Theo Johnson could end up being this Giants starting tight end. We don't know that for sure. There's going to be a lot of competition, and he may not start right away. He may not even start as a rookie, but I don't think it's going to be too long or too far down the road before Theo Johnson is the Giants starting tight end. It could be next year, but that I do think that will eventually happen. I mean, and we'll talk about this a little later when we talk about the scene of the lead up to Giants taking Theo, but he clearly was a great prospect and someone that the Giants thought very highly of. So I was grateful that they did not do that trade.
Football season is coming, and so is the next college semester. If you need funding, a Citizens student loan could help you pay for 100% of your school certified costs. Get your rate quote in about 2 minutes at citizensbank.com/pay-for-college. All right, they did get the cornerback, Matt, in round 3, a guy that they termed a 3-down nickel cornerback.
This might have been my favorite part of the whole episode, just the talking about Drew Phillips. There were so many different things here that I thought was very interesting. First of all, Jerome Henderson and Shane Bowen, who Joe Shane asked their opinions of Drew Phillips prior to calling in the pick, both said that they see him as a 3-down nickel cornerback. Joe also mentioned that they see him potentially starting or playing inside and outside.
Yep. Which
we know how much the coaching staff loves having versatility at basically any position on this roster. But the quote that really stood out was, I believe it was Joe that said that Drew Phillips was the last corner we'd be fired up about before getting to the developmental guys. So again, another guy that they clearly thought this kid can come in and play right away. I mean, Joe mentioned that if they were to get Drew Phillips, they'd be getting a starting cornerback. He called him a starting corner multiple times in that scene or in that little segment of the show. So they clearly thought very high of him. And I like that they went back and showed the clip of Drew Phillips when he came for a visit earlier in the offseason with Joe and Brian Dable. And I believe it was Dabes asked him, what is your number one trait on the field? And he said that it's his toughness. And he said, I'm not scared of anyone once I step on the field. I love hearing that from any guy on the field, any position, but especially a potential starting corner who's going to have to face some, very talented wide receivers. I love a guy that has the mentality of, I'm not afraid of anyone. I know what I can do, and I'm willing to go up against anyone.
Yeah, and I think more importantly, if a guy, you're going to have to play inside that has to do a lot of run support stuff against pulling guards and, tight ends, you need a guy that's willing to stick their nose in there and be tough to stop the run, especially when you're playing inside.
Yeah, and I mean, we're only a week into training camp, but we've already seen Drew Phillips make multiple plays in the run game.
That's correct.
Running up and shutting down running backs, at or behind the line of scrimmage. So, again, it's only been a week of camp, but so far, the things that, they discussed about Phillips, his characteristics, we've already seen on the field.
Yeah, he's not just a cover corner. He's a football player. He'll stick his nose in there and
he's got the right attitude.
Absolutely, 100%. Third round now, or rather third day, and we kind of heard from Tim McDonald and we heard from Brandon Brown throughout the episode as well, along with Joe Shane. Talked about how day 3 is tough because you're looking for needs that you want to fill, but you also want to pick the best player. So you kind of have to balance those things as you move forward here. I'm always a best player available guy on day 3 because I feel like it's so tough to try to fill a need. There's just not that many guys left on the board that you think can eventually become a starter. So if there's a guy out there that you think can become a good player, just pick him, and then you figure it out afterwards. But the Giants did manage, I think, to do both. And we'll start with Theo Johnson. And they talked about his explosive measurables. Brian Dable really liked his actual physical measurables in addition to that, talking about him as a guy that's 6'6", 260, that can move. And I don't know if it was Shea Tierney or someone that had him at one of the All-Star games. Had a little scatter.
It was Tierney at the
right?
Senior Bowl.
And it was basically said he's respectful, but he's tough, and he never wants to miss a rep. So it seemed to be a good combination of traits that they liked.
Yeah, I mean, that was the one guy where at least that we saw in Hard Knocks where Joe said there was just total conviction from the scouts and the coaching staff. Everyone seemed to be on the same page about Theo Johnson. A good thing that the Giants were able to do was, and Joe mentioned this, was they got so much exposure to him throughout the offseason. I don't know if anyone went to a Penn State game to scout him during last season. They didn't mention that, but
I'm sure somebody was in one at some point.
For sure. But then the Senior Bowl, we saw the one brief clip of Shea Tierney talking to Theo Johnson on the field, as you just mentioned. Then Dennis Hickey, along with a couple of scouts, were at the Penn State Pro Day. I don't know if they met him at the Combine, but they clearly, prior to the draft, had multiple occasions where someone from the organization, someone from the front office or coaching staff, was talking to him, kind of getting their hands on him, seeing...
Dave, wasn't there a scene where Dable was sitting down with him at a table in front of a large TV monitor, going through a play?
Yes.
That might have been, at the Combine, they do the little 10 minutes at a time interviews with these guys. My guess is that was what they call the car wash, and they bring the guys kind of in and out. That's where it looked like maybe Dable was.
Yeah, they didn't. I think you might be right, because they didn't actually say where that scene was.
I was actually trying to figure it out watching
Me too.
it.
I'm I thought maybe they met with him at the Senior Bowl potentially, but I couldn't.
You know what?
I couldn't figure it out.
That also could have been the Senior Bowl. You got a little bit of time with these guys at the Senior Bowl too, so it actually, you're right. That also could have been the Senior Bowl, no question.
Yeah, but
trying to figure out where Dable wore that black hat. Did he wear the black hat at the Senior Bowl or at the Combine? I'm trying to remember. I think he had it on the Combine.
We'd have to look back at the photos on Giants.com.
We are.
You love turf. You're good at it. So you start a turf biz. Business grows, your savings grow. Become the most celebrated name in turf. Are you ready for all that life brings?
But yeah, it was clear that so many people in the front office and the coaching staff loved him, loved everything about him. Coach called him a dog, which I feel like there have been a couple of guys in this draft class that have gotten that, characteristic.
I think we're up to 3 dogs now.
And the other thing that just stood out to me, I don't know if it was Joe or Dabe's, but they just mentioned that he's so explosive for a guy his size.
Yeah.
I mean, he's 6'6", 240, 245?
Yeah, I think bigger than that even.
250, around that size.
Yeah, I'll check it.
And he's fast. So these are, at that point, we didn't know whether or not Darren Waller was going to retire. It seemed like maybe they had an idea of where he was leaning, given the fact that they went and, targeted Theo Johnson in the 4th round. But yeah, it's not that I expect
6'6", 259.
259. Wow.
Yeah.
That's even bigger than I thought.
Yeah. Large guy. And,
Yeah.
and again, when you have a guy that size that tested the way he did, and they kind of went through his measurements, 4.57 40-yard dash, a 1.55 split, which is great. Then he also jumped just under 40 inches, a 10.5-foot broad jump, a 7.15 3-cone, a 4.19 short shuttle. And look, tight end has proven to be a traits position. Mm-hmm. They don't all hit. We've had plenty of guys with traits get drafted over the last couple of years, and they haven't hit. But the guys that do, more often than not, test extremely well.
Yeah, we on BBK we've talked about his RAS score,
yes,
being one of the highest a tight end has gotten in the last 40 years, and to have a guy that athletic with his size, that doesn't come around too often.
Yeah, and Tyrone Chasey, he tested similarly well. They didn't talk much about his athletics test, and they did talk about how the analytics department had some good numbers on him in terms of explosive plays per touch. And look, we saw that, and they said they basically took the fact that he'd only been a running back for 1 year, was an older prospect, it turned that into a positive that, well, maybe there's some more upside here where he can continue to get better since he doesn't have a lot of experience at the position.
Yeah, Joe kind of mentioned how some teams thought that was a negative for Tyrone Tracy, but they viewed it as a positive. Less carries under his belt, could potentially have a little more longevity in the NFL at that point. It was good to hear Joe talk about how the analytics department was so high on him, and clearly showing that Joe relies on those guys and trusts them with their opinions and their research that they do on these prospects. And the other thing that I wrote down here was Joe mentioning his explosive play per touch, ranking towards the top of all the running backs in the draft. So when you get to the 5th round, you can get a guy like that. It's 100% worth. I don't even want to call it a risk because it's a 5th round pick. If a 5th round pick doesn't hit, no one's gonna blame you. It's not like the end of the world. But Tyrone Tracy seems like a guy that clearly the front office thinks very highly of, and thinks that he could be a part of this offense, both now and moving forward into the future.
No, absolutely, and I think they're excited about it. And then finally, they drafted Darius Muasau out of UCLA.
Yeah, which they, unfortunately for Darius, they kind of just breezed over that part of the draft.
They had a nice video of him with the little lay on and all.
Yeah,
that sort of
and
stuff,
then when they showed, was it
Joe and
Marie and Beth
wives? Yeah,
talking about watching his little selfie video. Which shout out to the Giants social team for organizing and getting those videos on draft weekend. But yeah, there wasn't much shown about Darius Muasau and what went on to make, lead the Giants to that selection. But we've spoken about him before, and I think he's a guy that, at least this season, could be a big contributor on special teams.
Yeah, we had some cameos from our social team during the episode as well.
Oh yeah,
a lot of cameos. We had other cameos too throughout the episode.
The hard-hitting question of was it Bachelor or Love Is Blind?
Yes, which and it was pretty clear. I think it was Andrew Phillips. Is that who she was talking?
Yeah,
Emma was talking to, and got the feeling that he had no idea what either show was, which makes me like Andrew Phillips even more. I got to be honest with you. I really do. And then they kind of did a little montage at the end. And the one thing, a couple fans have pointed this out, like somebody as an athlete as much as Brian Dable likes Malik Nabers. Because, my gosh, he is a fan. And if you're drafting in fantasy this year, folks, you want a guy that's going to get a lot of targets, go draft Malik Nabers.
Yeah.
It's pretty clear Brian Dable's going to make sure that guy has the ball in his hands an awful lot.
Yeah, I wrote down this quote I forgot to mention earlier from Dabes, word for word. We knew that was going to be the player that we were going to take if he was there. That's conviction right there. You love to see it. And just sticking on Nabers for a second, we forgot to mention the little segment of the show where Joe talked about the benefit of having an elite wide receiver on a rookie contract. Mm-hmm. I mean, as we've seen this offseason, the last couple off seasons, the top wide receivers in the league are signing crazy contracts. $30-35 million a year.
And staying with their team. So they're not becoming available on the free agent market.
You rarely see one of these top elite wide receivers become available. And even if they do, it would likely be in a trade, and that's going to cost you some serious draft capital.
You took the words right out of my mouth. It's just like the Brian Burns deal, right? Wide receivers are very much like edge rushers. The elite guys are not going to hit the free agency market. You're going to have to use draft capital along with money to go and get those guys.
Yeah, so now the Giants have Malik Nabers, who they clearly think can become an elite wide receiver. He's not there yet, obviously. He's never played it down in the NFL yet, but they clearly think that he has the ability to become one of the top wide receivers in the league, and they're now going to have him on a rookie contract for 4 years, plus the fifth-year option. I mean, in an ideal world, Malik plays so well that they end up signing him to a big extension way before the end of that contract. But nonetheless, they have him under team control now for 5 years at a very reasonable rate for what they think he's going to contribute on the field.
Yeah, should be a lot of fun. Final thoughts before we say goodbye here as we do our final Hard Knocks review?
Love the show overall. I'm happy that they did it. I mean, as a football nerd and someone that loves the offseason part of the NFL, it was very cool just to see behind the scenes of a front office and like really in depth. And I seriously hope they continue this version of Hard Knocks.
Do you think they'll find another team to do it?
Well, I think similar to the preseason one, they'll force another team to do it.
You think they're going to try to make this mandatory?
I don't see why not. I mean, they already have preseason that's mandatory and the in-season that's mandatory. Why not make the off-season one mandatory, especially because moving forward, it's not going to be us again, at least not for a long time.
Say what, though? If you're doing 3 of these a year, teams going to come up more frequently than you think.
That's true. I mean, I feel like
especially since 4 teams are in the in-season one.
I was going to say, if they can, especially if they can continue the in-season one being a whole division, then yeah, the Giants will make an appearance on Hard Knocks again, not too far down the road. But at the same time, if you're covering 4 teams, that's less airtime per team, so less being shown in each of those buildings.
So this afternoon, I'm going to have a chance to talk to 2 of the producers behind the scenes of Hard Knocks. So I'll pepper them with a bunch of questions of how they went about this. Here's what I'm going to do. Just for the crazies out there, I'm going to throw all the crazy conspiracy theories at them, and I'm going to let them shoot them all down.
What are some of these crazy conspiracy theories?
Oh, staging scenes, deceptively editing stuff to show something happened even though it really didn't. So basically lying through deceptive editing. So I'm going to throw all these conspiracy theories at them and let them just laugh and shoot them down, which will be fun. I'm also going to ask how the in-season with the whole division is going to work. I'm actually just curious about that.
Yeah, same here.
So we'll find out. We'll have that episode up probably maybe we'll move that up to Friday, Pearson, to get it all out of the way this week, and we'll move Sando to Monday of next week. But we'll figure that out. It's coming your way. Thanks for being with us on the Giants Huddle podcast, brought to you by Citizens, the official bank of the New York Football Giants. For Matt Citak, this has been fun doing these episodes with you, my friend.
Yeah.
I am John Schmeelk, and we probably won't be able to talk about Hard Knocks and the Giants for a very long time, but I hope you enjoyed these episodes. Stay tuned to the Giants Huddle podcast for continuing coverage of everything New York Giants throughout training camp.